Okay, let's turn to Russia. Let's turn to the news at hand. You said on Sunday that events revealed, quote unquote, real cracks there. So it's a few days later. Is it your and your colleagues' sense that these cracks are widening? Do we know enough? Is it just the opposite? We see these cracks narrowing. What is our sense of what's transpired in the last few days, which way the arrows are going?
Well, first, this is a moving picture, and I don't think we've seen the last act. And I think we have to have a certain amount of humility in any predictions we make about where this is going. But I think we can say this, or at least we know this much. First, you know, if you take a step back, it is genuinely extraordinary that we've gone from a place where we were 16 months ago, where you had Russian forces on the outskirts of Kyiv. They thought they would take the city in a matter of days. They thought they would erase Ukraine from the map as an independent country, to a place where we were this weekend, where you had forces moving on Russia's capital, Moscow, mercenaries of Putin's own making. That, in a way, encapsulates the extent to which this aggression against Ukraine has been a failure across the board for Putin. And we see it by virtually every metric. Russia is worse off economically. It's worse off militarily. Its standing in the world has plummeted. It's managed to wean Europe off of Russian energy in the space of a little over a year. It's managed to help NATO become stronger, more united, and bigger. And of course, it's managed to alienate virtually every Ukrainian and also unite Ukraine as never before. This last episode, showing to some extent the internal dimensions of this failure, I think speaks volumes. But I don't want to predict where this is going to go, when it's going to get there. I do know that Putin has a lot of new questions that he has to answer for.
In some ways, you're echoing Prigozhin's critique basically of this war.
Well, far be it for me to let's keep this in mind. Mr. Prigozhin is, like Mr. Putin, someone who has committed horrific atrocities in Ukraine, in Africa, in Syria. Wherever Wagner goes, death, destruction, exploitation follow. But the fact, Richard, that he directly challenged President Putin, the fact that, as you said, he questioned the very premises that Putin has advanced for the war, is significant. But again, how this plays out in Russia, it is ultimately an internal issue for them, and they're going to have to work through it.
Okay, so how it plays out, I agree with you. One place where we can be more than a bystander is when it comes to policy towards Ukraine. So the question is, we're now in month 17. Given what's happened, do we dial up or down what we say, what we do differently because of what's happened the last 5 days?
The short answer is no. I think what we've done and what we're doing in terms of building a pretty remarkable coalition that has sustained itself for 16 months now, I think is actually even more solid than at the outset in terms of its support for Ukraine, exerting pressure on Russia, strengthening our own defensive alliance. We're sticking with that program. The only thing I'd say is that besides the rather extraordinary effort that's been underway to help Ukraine in the moment, to make sure that it has everything it needs for this counteroffensive, where it's trying to take back more of the land that was seized from it by Russia, there's also a longer-term aspect to this, and it's important in a number of ways. And the longer-term aspect is this. First, making sure that we're also working in a sustainable way to help Ukraine build up its deterrent and defense capacity for the medium and long term, so that Putin could not repeat this exercise in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. And the flip side of that is something I just came back from in London. There was a reconstruction conference that brought together not only countries that care about Ukraine, not only the international financial institutions, but also the private sector, which ultimately is going to be the difference between a Ukraine that survives and a Ukraine that thrives if the investment is forthcoming. And this longer-term plan is usually important in two ways. First, because it is the difference between a Ukraine that actually really succeeds. But second, because the biggest impediment right now to finding peace, a just and durable peace, and we can come back to that, the biggest impediment to getting to how we know this has to end at some point, a negotiation, diplomacy, is President Putin's conviction that he can outlast Ukraine and he can outlast all of us. The more we are able to disabuse him of that notion, the more likely it is that at some point he'll come to the table.
So building on that, could one element of that be whether when we get together with our allies in 2 weeks or some other point that we extend Ukraine assurances? Charlie Kupchan and I have written about Article 4 assurances under the NATO treaty. Some have advocated Article 5. I think that might be premature. What matters more is what you think. Some have talked about the model of the Israeli relationship. But why not think about assurances for Ukraine, which further signals Putin that time is not his friend?
Yeah. Richard, I think that's exactly right. And I've read carefully what you and Charlie wrote, as I always do.
It's in Foreign Affairs magazine. I want to mention that. Get one for the home team.
Available at a newsstand near you. There are two things that I think are important. One is you're going to see at the NATO summit a very robust package for Ukraine, political and practical. I'm not going to get ahead of where we land in Vilnius, but I'm pretty confident in that. The second, at the same time, a number of us are looking, by a number of us, I mean a number of countries are looking at, in parallel, in addition to what happens at NATO, what can we do to do just what I said a moment ago, which is to help Ukraine build up its long-term deterrent and defense capacity. And there's a lot that goes into that, but I'm also pretty confident that that's a place we're going to get to.